Hello there, welcome to my review of the Rockford Files Season 5, Episode 10, A Fast Count, written by Gordon T. Dawson and directed by Reza Badi. The episode begins at Jim's trailer with him watching a boxing match, interrupted by a car commercial that I'm sure will have no further connection to the episode. We then cut to a boxing gym the next day, where trainer Maury Hawthorne is talking with one of his boxers, Jesus Hernandez. Jim is waiting to see Maury, wanting to sell his stake in Hernandez, as the young boxer can't get a fight. Maury explains that the kid can't get a shot at the big names unless he agrees to give up a 50% stake in Jesus, because he's too good.
Bobo Rydel's owner knows Jesus can whip him.
And the one who wants that 50% stake is Ruth Beatson White, the woman from the car commercial that we saw just a few moments ago. This is a bit of a complicated way to kick off the episode with a lot of information coming at us. But the way they explain it makes sense, and all we really need to know is that it's the reason Jim is involved from the off. Having introduced Beatson White in the extended TV spot means we can easily put a face to the name and have a good enough idea of what's behind all the goings-on. Their argument is interrupted by an FBI raid, arresting Maury for attempting to bribe a federal official, something Maury denies.
What are you talking about, attempted bribery?
Jim finds out from Jesus that Maury may have tried to bribe an immigration official in order to keep Jesus' mother-in-law in the country, having illegally entered the country 38 years earlier and settled in LA. Maury denies making the bribe, but the evidence is pretty compelling, and so Maury pleads with Jim to clear his name. Despite the circumstantial evidence being strong, Jim quickly finds out there's nothing directly connecting the bribe drop-off to Maury, other than a boxer being the one who dropped it off.
No, I had a prize fighter drop it off.
What'd he look like?
A boxer that Maury and Jesus identify as Tony Malavida. Jim tracks him down and puts the frighteners on him enough so that he leads Jim to his contact. But it's not enough to identify the man in the silver caddy. Jim then finds out that someone is making an offer to buy out the stakes in Jesus, and it's Ruth Beatson White and her husband. But there's another hitch.
Maury sold 195% of Jesus?
Jim is able to convince the other investors to wait before they sell, but also choose Maury out.
I'd be interested to hear how selling almost 200% of anything isn't illegal.
While he explains how it's possible to sell 200% of something that he only owned 33% of to begin with. Something which is probably best not to worry too much about. As if things couldn't get any worse, Dennis arrives with the feds to arrest Maury for murder, as Tony Malavida has turned up dead.
Oh boy, when the locals and the feds team up, look out.
This is essentially an extended first act, as there's so much to set up, and while it has complexity, it never feels complicated. The way the story unfolds gives it enough breathing room to set everything up fairly naturally, if a little truncated, meaning that we understand why Jim is involved, what the stakes are, and what's happening. It makes sense that the FBI thinks Maury bribed an official, it makes sense that Jim is investigating, it makes sense that Ruth wants to buy Jesus, and it makes sense that Malavida's murder occurs and is then pinned on Maury. It's now up to Jim to find out the who, and prove it. Unfortunately, he's impeded by a couple of goons who try and scare him off, cementing in our minds that Maury is innocent. The next day, Ruth approaches Maury with an offer to buy Jesus, which Jim interrupts, and Maury reveals in passing that the feds took his gun.
Lousy feds. Took everything. Even my old 32 I stashed away.
I have to assume that they must have cut a scene out where Ruth asks to meet Rockford, probably for time, as they slip in a pretty badly ADR'd line as she leaves.
I want to talk to you, Rockford. 8 sharp. Peppies.
And we then immediately cut to her and Jim meeting. Either that, or they realise they didn't have an explanation as to why the pair are together, being watched by Ruth's henpecked husband. I wouldn't normally comment on the ADR as it's mostly inconsequential, but this one really stood out and so I thought it was worth drawing attention to. At the meeting, Ruth is trying a new tactic to get Jim out of the way, a charm offensive, to buy Jim out. But he thinks she's responsible for the bribe, the murder, and the ruining of Maury's career, which she denies, and Jim doesn't buy, especially when he sees the guy who was talking to Malavida in one of her commercials.
Folks, you all know Skip LaForce, my sales manager.
Jim confronts this sales manager, Skip, before the two goons arrive and he has to get creative.
I think
But in the process he does discover that Ruth might not be aware of the various crimes of her employee. Jim heads off to save Maury, who's in a meeting with Ruth, and lets them both know they've all been tricked. But it's too late, as Skip and the goons arrive, planning to kill Ruth and frame Maury, as it was them, not the feds, that took Maury's gun.
It's my 32. I thought the feds had it.
The entire scheme was an elaborate plan between Skip and Ruth's husband, as they were tired of listening to a woman and wanted her business operation, and had nothing to do with the boxing, other than Maury being a patsy. And as they wait for the right moment to finish the trio off, Jim and Maury are able to get the upper hand. The epilogue sees Jim get a very small return on his investment, as usual, and an offer from Ruth that it seems like he can't refuse.
I have been racking my brain trying to come up with a way to express my gratitude.
This episode has a really strong plot, with all the intricate details weaving together perfectly, which is really not an easy thing to achieve when there's so much going on. It genuinely seems as if Ruth is definitely behind it for most of the episode, although with enough wiggle room to make sense when it turns out that she's not. It lets us believe that the only way a woman could be so successful in business is if she's also completely amoral and willing to commit any crime necessary to stay on top, before neatly subverting that. She is a, if you'll excuse the pun, ruthless businesswoman, but she's not a monster. Where I think it falls down, and perhaps could have done with a little more time, and the input of a female writer, is in its somewhat one-dimensional portrayal of Ruth. She's unnecessarily hard on her husband from the start, almost making him sympathetic, and she's hostile to everyone else in the episode, meaning when she reveals her humble past to Rockford, he doesn't believe it, and neither do we. Then, in the epilogue, we see that she has realised that she needs to be less domineering as a result of her husband, an employee, wanting to murder her, which I think is a bad lesson to take away from this story. What we don't get is the sense that she's had to fight hard to get where she is on her own, as a woman, other than when she tells us all of this at a point where we already don't trust her, which works for the story but not the character, and the lack of characterization of the husband just helps play into this. I also think it would have made for a more satisfactory epilogue had she come around to being less domineering, only to be told by Jim that it's not a bad thing to be strong-willed, or words to that effect, showing that it's not her that's wrong, but some of the terrible men in her life. Otherwise, it seems like she was just getting what was coming to her, which I don't think is the kind of direction of message the show usually goes for. For those reasons, I think this is a 4 out of 5 for me. As for the first time in a long time, it chose not to confront a social issue of the day quite so head-on as it normally does. Thank you. Goodbye.